The content of this video, as well as the thoughts, views, and opinions expressed herein, belong to the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views of Brigham Young University or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Well, thank you so much for coming today. I know there is a lot of classes to choose from, so I'm grateful you've chosen this one today. Some of my good friends are going to other classes because they think they're better, so I understand if you prefer other classes, that's fine with me. My first experience in the JSB auditorium was as a freshman at BYU. This was my physical science class, and it was really intimidating when I was a freshman, and I don't think it's changed much now that I'm presenting either. So still very intimidating. So if you've been with us for the last 2 days, thanks for coming and thanks for sticking in here a third day. Each lecture is going to build on the past, so you didn't have to be here for the first two, but it does give you some helpful background as we flow into today. So on the first day, we kind of hung out in Philadelphia and talked about the convention. And then on the second day, we went up the Pennsylvania Turnpike for 4 hours, and we went to Harmony, Pennsylvania, and talked about Harmony and William Penn. So today we're going to head back to Philadelphia, and we're going to get on an international flight, and we're going to check out the world, and we're going to see what the U.S. Constitution looks like around the world. So that's what we're going to compare worldwide constitutions. Now, my background in this is I teach a comparative constitutional law course at a law school in Paris, and I've done that for about 10 years. So I do not teach in French. If you asked me to bear my testimony in French, I could do it. Teach comparative constitutional law, it's a little more difficult. So I teach in English to European students. So it's very much an international focused course. But before we start, I always like to give you something a little bit about me so you can get to know me better. And this is my daughter, Adeline. And this is a story of redemption. Don't we always need, all of us need sometimes just another chance and another try. So this is her bike. It is actually a very fancy bike that someone gave us. It's got if you're familiar with mountain bikes, it's a full suspension Santa Cruz, which is really fancy. And so we told her, be careful with your bike. You know, don't leave it out in public, or it's going to get stolen. So one day she went out on her bike. She said she was going out for a ride, and she decided to stop by a Maverick and pick up some food items. And so she stopped at the Maverick and left her bike behind the Maverick and went in, picked up a food item, and came out, and her bike was gone. So she had disobeyed us and lost this really fancy mountain bike. And she was devastated. We reported to the police. My wife Shannon called me, and she was a little frantic on the phone that the bike had been stolen. And so a few weeks went by. We were pretty sad. Adeline was definitely sad. And the police station called us, and they said, we found this bike that looks a little like your bike. Do you want to come down and check it out? So Adeline went down to the police station. And this is the bike that they had found. Whoever had stolen it had taken it and spray painted it pink. And they had left it out in the park, and the police had identified it and got it. So she got her bike back. So what at once seemed like a complete, failure, she was redeemed. She got her bike back and was made whole. So I think sometimes in life we do make mistakes, but then there is redemption. And for Adeline, this was a redemptive moment. So today I'm going to recap briefly the last two lectures. We're going to talk about Joseph and Harmony, and I left the last lecture with a question. If Harmony was this protective environment, why did Joseph leave to go to Fayette for that last month to translate the small plate of Nephi? The small plates of Nephi. So we're going to talk about that. Then we're going to take the Constitution and we're going to spread it all over the world and see what the world's doing with the U.S. Constitution. It's pretty incredible, the influence that the U.S. Constitution has had on the world. And then a recent thing I've been thinking about during this week, so I just added it in literally last night, is looking at constitutions and church growth. And so it's very very raw, but I just want to give you some of my thoughts on that. I'm going to keep trying to study it. So maybe next time I'll have more information. But we talked about the first class that there were these wise delegates, these men, and in the Doctrine and Covenants, it's confirmed that they were established for the purpose of the Constitution, that these wise men were raised up for the very purpose of protecting us from an intrusive government, and that's why they did the Constitution. And we know that Joseph Smith was a great advocate of the Constitution. He called it a heavenly banner. Joseph did find a fault with the Constitution, that it did not protect his rights during all the persecution in Missouri and other places, but he did believe it was an inspired document. He also he said, let me just see my notes here. So, but Joseph was content with the Constitution, and even to the point where when the Constitution was failing to redress his grievances, he went to you may know this story, he traveled to Washington, D.C. He met with President Van Buren. This was in February of 1840. And he said, hey, our rights are not being protected. And if you remember, President Van Buren's response was less than sympathetic. He pretty much says, your cause is just, but I can't do anything for you. So I think that caused Joseph Smith to be a little bit disappointed in that. We know that George Washington called the Constitution a miracle, and many other prophets and delegates prophets of the church and delegates have called it a miracle. And then President Brigham Young talked about the Constitution and that the framers were inspired on high. And then we've seen this painting a number of different times, but this is the moment. This is the convention at Philadelphia. We now know the Articles of Confederation were failing, and that's why they called the convention. 55 delegates from 12 states, secret for 4 months. And we talked about the ideals of the founders. We learned all about George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and my favorite underestimated framer, Governor Morris. And we can even identify them in this painting. If you remember, we did that the first day. And do we remember where Thomas Jefferson was? Paris, got it. Yeah, so Thomas Jefferson was in Paris and John Adams was in London. So they were not delegates at the convention. So that's a quick recap of where we've been. So let's get back to Harmony, Pennsylvania. We talked about the significance of Pennsylvania law and William Penn in the restoration of the gospel, and that Harmony was a protective enclave, religious enclave for Joseph to accomplish very important tasks in founding the church. And we talked about President Nelson, who, when he dedicated the priesthood restoration site in 2015, he said, Harmony provided Joseph with the spiritual solitude and protection. With spiritual solitude and protection, allowing him to focus on the translation of the Book of Mormon. And then I gave you a number of different reasons why I thought Harmony was unique, in particular in its protections. It's the Pennsylvania constitutions of 1790 and 1776, William Penn and his policies, the Updegraff Supreme Court decision that came down 1 year before Joseph entered Harmony, the Hale family and Isaac Hale, Emma Hale's father, his protection, and then just the remote nature of Harmony, that it was somewhat off the grid. So then if Harmony was this protective, why did Joseph and Aller have to leave to go to Fayette? So I think there's two clues to tell us why Pennsylvania at that time didn't afford the protection, but was still a good place. So first, there's a letter written by Joseph to Oliver. We're going to look at that letter right now. And then second, I'm going to show you a picture of the house where Joseph lived when he was in Harmony. And that actually gives us some really good clues about this. So first, the letter. This is a letter that Joseph wrote to Oliver on October 4th, 1829. So this is right at the time where Oliver is in Palmyra managing and organizing the printing of the Book of Mormon. All right, he's working there, and Joseph is at his home in Harmony. And this is, I broke this letter into two so you could see it better. But just look at the handwriting, Joseph's handwriting for an uneducated young person. Just really beautiful, beautiful handwriting. You can see he wrote at the top there, if you look at the top of the screen, Harmony, October 1829. And then you can see this is addressed to Oliver. Let's see, we can go over here and see his he signs it right here, Joseph Smith Jr. So you can see right there in the corner where he has signed the letter. Let me see if I can highlight it for you. Right down here where he would have signed it. So, all right, so what's the significance of this letter then? Well, this is the text that kind of stands out to me. So he tells Oliver this: I found all well the people in Harmony, all friendly to us. And I used his spelling, so I didn't update or modernize the spelling. All friendly to us, except a few who are in opposition to everything, unless it is something that is exactly like themselves. And two of our most formidable persecutors are now under censure and cited to a trial in the church for crimes which, if true, are worse than all the gold book business. We do not rejoice in the affliction of our enemies, but we shall be glad to have the truth prevail. So what does this mean? Let's break this down a little bit. So apparently there's two persecutors in Harmony that are committing some type of crime. And we don't know if that crime's against Joseph, or an Oliver. It's a little bit unclear to us. We also don't know the identity of these persecutors. This is all we have. But he says there's a trial in the church for these crimes. And if you remember, we talked about Pennsylvania being unique and that it gave churches a sphere of influence, that churches could operate without government interference. And so it looks like it's a church trial that these persecutors are going to be facing. Maybe it's a legal trial. We just don't know. What are the crimes? We don't know what the crimes are either. And then at the end, he says he mentions the gold book business. Now, obviously, Joseph doesn't call his own translating the gold book business, right? He calls it an inspired translation of the Book of Mormon. But that's what probably people are labeling it in Harmony, right? They're probably calling it the gold book business, as if he's trying to make money. So he kind of makes fun of that a little bit and saying they're doing things that are probably worse than what I'm doing, which is this gold book business. And then he says the truth. We're glad to have the truth prevail. So whatever these persecutors were doing, whatever happened, truth prevailed and they were stopped. All right, they had a trial and Pennsylvania law operated properly, or the church law did, and it stopped them. So whatever was that persecution at the time was probably pretty urgent for them to leave. And then they were able to come back to Harmony, and that's why Joseph settled back in Harmony after finishing the translation. That's our first clue that, hey, maybe Pennsylvania law did operate properly and did provide the protection. Second clue, all right, here is Joseph and Emma's home, and this is a picture from 1880. So this is 50 years after they would have left Harmony. They left Harmony in about 1830. Okay, and this is an observation that Mark Staker, who's the master curator for the historic division of the church, he made this observation. And during 1829, 1830, Joseph added two additions to his house. So he added a lean-to on one side, and you can see that's on the left side. There's a lean-to here. Let me see if I can circle, if my pen will work and I can circle it for you. There's a lean-to, no, it wouldn't work. Okay, so there's a lean-to over on this side. You can see that on the left. And on the other side, he added what they call a salt box. And the salt box is the big thing right here. This is the salt box, this huge addition right here. And then the lean-to is over here. So if you go to Harmony today, you're just going to see the lean-to and the house. They didn't add the salt box. All right, so why would this salt box tripled the size of his house? And so why would Joseph, and this is just speculation, why this 2-story salt box home, why did he add that on? And who knows how he got it there? Maybe Mark would know that better not. But getting that I think it was previously built, so somehow he hauled it over there. But with this large addition, we can speculate that maybe he thought the headquarters of the church was supposed to be in Harmony. Maybe this was a place to house missionaries. Maybe there was a future that Joseph had in mind in 1829 and 1830 to be in Harmony and establish the headquarters of the church. Now, obviously that changed, right? It went to Kirtland, then Missouri, and then all the way out west to here we are right now. But those two clues kind of indicate us that maybe Harmony did provide that protection. Even though they had to leave temporarily, it did provide that protection for them to translate the plates. All right, so getting to the constitutions worldwide, we're going to talk about this, the extraterritorial or international influence of the constitutions. And I think that's a question we all often have, like, is it for the United States only? And the Doctrine and Covenants actually gives us some direction here. So, and this is the same section we've been in, D&C 101, that Joseph Smith received in Kirtland, Ohio. But here's what God said: according to the laws and constitution of the people, which I have suffered to be established, and should be maintained for the rights and protection of all flesh. So that's everybody, all flesh. That's not just the United States, that's the entire world. And that's the Constitution was established for the entire world. So we're going to today study, what has the Constitution done in the world. In his talk in April 2021, this is the very beginning, and I don't know if I've listened to and read Elder President Oaks talk a few times, and there's a lot packed in there in this general conference talk. But he said this, that the United States constitutions so it is a common heritage of constitutions around the world. So the United States Constitution is a common heritage around the world. So it's for the benefit of the entire world. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the inspired principles that President Oaks mentioned in his talk. He mentioned 5. And we're going to see how those have been used from around the world. And I'm also going to add 2 of my own. And again, these are non-authoritative and maybe not even inspired, but they're 2 I've thought of. And then we'll talk about these. So J. Reuben Clark said there were 3 great fundamental constitutional principles: separation of powers, freedom of speech, press and religion, and equality before the law. And if you know, he was, that's the namesake of the law school, and I'm the director of a society named after him as well. So President Clark talked a lot about the Constitution. Ezra Taft Benson also talked about the Constitution a lot, and he had 5 provisions he mentions in his talk about the Constitution: sovereignty of the people, separation of powers, limited powers of government, principle of representation, and moral and righteous people. And we'll talk a little bit more about each one of those as we go through this. But so I'm just showing that several prophets or authorities from our church have talked about these inspired principles. And then the ones we'll really focus today are these 5 from President Oaks. And when he said this in conference, he was very careful with his words. He says there's at least 5. In other words, there's more room for more inspiration, but he's just picking out the 5 that stand out to him. So people are the source of power, division of power, and separation of power. So division of power is going to be what we'll call vertical, and separation of power, we're going to call that horizontal. And we'll explain that. But one's vertical, one's horizontal. A written Bill of Rights, and then the purpose of the Constitution. So let's jump right in. This is my first one. So we'll do my first 2, and then we'll get to the better ones that President Oaks has. So I think it's inspired that the document is written. President Oaks said in his 1992 talk on the Constitution, the United States Constitution was the first written constitution in the world. And here I'm quoting a case, one of the most famous Supreme Court cases, Marbury versus Madison. And this is the Supreme Court saying the powers of the legislature are defined and limited, and those limits may not be mistaken or forgotten. The Constitution is written. And in United States law, if you go to law school, they're going to teach you this rule. They're going to teach you what's called this rule, the statute of frauds. What does that mean? It means that it mostly applies to real estate transactions, but if you're going to buy or sell real estate in the United States, it has to be written or it's essentially invalid. They're not going to, the court will not enforce an oral agreement over real estate. Why does that rule? Because a written agreement protects the buyer and the seller. The buyer knows what the buyer is buying, the seller knows what the seller is selling. It just defines the relationship. And that's what a written constitution does. It keeps each side responsible. The government is responsible not to infringe on the people's rights, and the people know their rights. So this is, to us, we just say, yeah, of course it's written. But before the United States Constitution, no one had ever written a comprehensive document like this. I mean, this was revolutionary to just write it down. So if you ever go to the Philadelphia Temple, I'll go back here. So I have this image of two quills, and this is kind of a neat thing. On a lot of the decor in the Philadelphia Temple, there's two quills. And someone told me that one quill represents the U.S. Constitution, the other quill represents the Book of Mormon, which both have very strong roots in Pennsylvania. So if you ever go in the Philadelphia Temple, look for those. Look for that decor on some of the furniture. Okay, so now in the world, what has the world done with this? Well, there's only 3 countries in the world that don't have a written constitution now. So almost every country in the world has now written down these rights. So the 3 that do not have them are United Kingdom, New Zealand, and Israel. But they still have very strong constitutional traditions. So the United Kingdom calls it their uncodified constitution. But if you go to the United Kingdom's website, the government website, they have all kinds of documents and explanations about what their constitution is. So they really, in essence, do have a constitution-like documents. Israel has made attempts for a constitution, but they have not been successful. So they have what they call the basic law in Israel, and it's almost as authoritative as a constitution, but not quite. But that's kind of their substitute. And then New Zealand has the same constitutional heritage as England. And so their constitutions, it's just some documents that come together to form their constitution. Okay, so the next principle for me, and then we're going to get to Elder President Oaks' principles, but let me just tell you a quick story. So I coach gymnastics, and I once had a group of probably 10 to 12-year-old boys, probably 10 of them. And I think I was on the bars teaching them like a back hip circle or a kip or something like that. And one of the boys kept acting up, which, as you know, that's very unusual for boys, but he was acting up and he kept talking to everybody in the line. And so I told him once, hey, Andrew, I think his name was Andrew, stop doing that. And he then started again. I said, hey, Andrew, come on, stop doing that. He said it. So finally, I just had to sit him down and say, hey, you can't talk, okay? You're disrupting my class. He said, you can't tell me not to talk. I have a First Amendment right to speak. So he didn't know he was speaking to someone that had gone to law school and was a gymnastics coach. So I said, I am so impressed that you've quoted the Bill of Rights. That is impressive for a young man. But you forgot that the Constitution only applies to the government. It does not apply to me. So I can tell you whatever I want. You have to listen. So, and that's my second principle is the Constitution exists to limit government, not private conduct. So it's a contract between us and the government, not a contract between us. Now, there's some arguments here, and we're going to go through these. This is not a clear slam dunk for us. Like that, there's people that don't believe this is right. So we even have an exception in our own jurisprudence. So the 13th Amendment, which prohibits slavery, that applies to private conduct. So that's the only exception in our Constitution where the Constitution applies to private. We can't have slaves. The government can't have slaves, and we can't have slaves. So at its root, it's a public document, the Constitution. Public law, that relationship between the government and us. Private law is generally going to be between people. All right, so generally we look at constitutional law as a public law and not a private law. So let's look at some other countries. So India, in India, everything applies everything applies to the people. So there is no government. It's always the Constitution applies to private conduct, essentially. So they have not followed the U.S. example in that one. In most cases are filed against the state, and are the state versus a person versus person in India. Australia follows the same. South Africa. South Africa follows the same example as the U.S. So it does. The Constitution itself only applies to state conduct, but their Bill of Rights in South Africa binds people. So their Bill of Rights, all the rights that they list after their Constitution, applies to private conduct. So what are the arguments here? Well, there is some scholars that say the state, they call this the state action requirement. For there to be a constitutional violation, it has to be action by the state or the government, right? So private entity or any will not be subject to the Constitution. So the argument is that this requirement is unnecessary and makes no sense, and that it doesn't matter whether it's a state or a private person. These are so fundamental, these rights, that everyone should have them, that they should apply to people and to the government. So what's the argument against that? And this is the one I buy into. If right now, if the government is a contract between us and the government, it reserves the private interactions to the people. It's a private sphere where we can interact together. We'll call it a zone of private autonomy. So it safeguards that private area. If you let the government intrude in that in every way, what are the implications of that? So by applying the Constitution to private conduct, you actually eviscerate or remove that private sphere of conduct between citizens. And if you let the government in there, what happens afterward? Where does that go? So that's the argument that convinces me. Other people are convinced by the one I just shared with you, but that's kind of the issue there. All right, so let's go on to President Oak's 5 principles. So we just did my 2, and now we're going to do the 5. So the first is people are the source of power, and we talked about this a lot. We the people. That is such a strong statement. And guess what? It's the most popular phrase in international constitutions. Everyone loves this phrase, we the people. So that's my Governor Morris, that underestimated delegate who wrote those words, we the people. They've resonated throughout the world. And President Oak said in his talk, the source of government power is the people. And that's very different because this is in defiance of England, where the king was the source of power. But in the United States, there's no noble privilege. There's no king. The king does not own all the land. The power is with the people. And in Chief Justice John Marshall, who was one of the more famous Chief Justices of the Supreme Court, he said, the government proceeds directly from the people, is ordained and established in the name of the people. All right, and so you can see, in getting back to my favorite Governor Morris here, he wrote this, and these are the 7 verbs he used. when he wrote the preamble. And I'm just going to read off the verbs, but just feel how powerful this is. Form, establish, ensure, provide, promote, secure, ordain. What a powerful way to start off our Constitution. And the rest of the world loves it. President Ezra Taft Benson, when he spoke, he said there's two governmental systems, generally speaking, in the world. One, sovereign power is in one person or in a group of people. Or there's two, the power rests with the people. And obviously number two is what the founding fathers believed, and that's what we believe. Number one is a formula for tyranny. Number two shares and protects the power. Okay, so here's the Constitution of India. We, the people of India. South Africa. We, the people of South Africa. Brazil is close. We, the representatives of the Brazilian people. Not quite there, but we'll give them credit. We'll give them credit. And even Iraq. We, the people of Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia. Yeah, Mesopotamia. So we, the people. It's been adopted all over the world. Okay, let's go to the next constitutional principle. The dividing power between the nation and the state. And President Oaks said, significantly, the United States Constitution limits the national government to the exercise of powers granted expressly or by implication, and it reserves all other government powers to the states respectively or to the people. And this is what we call the federalism or vertical sharing of powers. So we have the federal government, then we have the states or constituents. And the Constitution does not really talk about federalism, but it is very explicit that it limits Article 1, which is the legislative powers, and it only gives limited powers to the legislature, which is Congress. And then all the other powers are reserved for the states. And this is essentially what the 10th Amendment says. It says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states or to the people. So that is federalism. In this chart here, it shows how we divide it here in the United States. There's certain, and I won't get into these in detail just in an interest of time, but we have powers delegated to the national government, and then we have powers reserved for the states, and there are some shared powers. Unfortunately, when you get your taxes, there's a state tax and a federal tax. They shouldn't have shared that one, huh? We could have just had one less taxation. Anyway, no, but yeah, that's a shared power, and there's other shared powers. But what does federalism do? What are the advantages of federalism? Well, it allows the constituent units, which we call states in the United States, to be individual, to individually govern themselves. So in Pennsylvania, I can eat cheesesteaks. And if you're in Idaho, you can have potatoes. And in Arizona, you can eat citrus. And Louisiana can have its own civil law. We all don't have to grow potatoes. But that's really what it does, is it allows for a unique representation tailored to each local level. So the epitome or the best example of federalism actually is not the United States, it's Switzerland. And I'm not saying that just because I served my mission in Switzerland, but it really is a great example. There are 3 levels of government, 26 cantons is what they call them. Their states are cantons. And they have 2,352 communes. They have 4 different cultures and 4 different national languages: German, French, Italian, and Romanish. And they're almost a confederation, which is a different term, but it is a federalism where they all survive together under one uniform government, but have their individual autonomy. Just some other differences. There are 17 of their cantons are German speaking, 4 French speaking, the most populous canton, Zurich, has a population 83 times larger than the smallest canton. So a lot of diversity in Switzerland, and they're able to do that under one federal umbrella. So very impressive model. So this is actually a world map, and it shows federal states versus unitary states. So federal states are states that embrace federalism, and then the competing model is unitary. And so there's actually more unitary states in the world than federal states, but a lot of these unitary states, to me, adopt some federalist principles. But a unitary state is where all the power is centralized, and essentially the top government, or the federal government, controls the states. So that would be, if we were a unitary state in the United States, all the state governors would be chosen by the executive president. They would not be chosen by the states. So that's the main difference, simplifying a little bit, the main difference between a unitary and a federal state. But we do see that there is a lot of federalism in the world after this Constitution, because of the Constitution. Okay, so we just talked about, and I know this feels like political science class, but I apologize. So now we're going to go vertical. We're going to go horizontal. We just did vertical. Federalism is vertical. Now we're going to go horizontal, and this is called the separation of powers. And this is the third principle that President Oaks spoke about. The inspiration of the American Convention was to delegate independent executive, legislative, and judicial powers. So we separate out our powers between an executive branch, judicial branch, and legislative branch. And this has been adopted. A lot of states have adopted this, whether they're a unitary or federal state. Most agree that this power at the top should be separated into these three branches. We see that in a lot of different places. I'll skip that one. So why do we divide it? Why do we divide the power among three? Well, if you've ever watched The Lord of the Rings, I think we are pretty clear that the one ring to rule them all model is not the best model, right? Now, just for you, for those who really are in The Lord of the Rings, how many rings was the one ring to rule them all, Sauron's ring? How many did it control? Any idea? Close. It's 19 in total. There were 19 rings in total. So 3 elf rings, 7 dwarf rings, and 9 rings of men. So that was the ultimate consolidation of power, and that's why we have this division of power. So we don't have those same issues. Here's 3 Supreme Court cases we could talk about, but these are what I call your stay in your lane cases. So this is where the Supreme Court had to tell, either the first was the judiciary, right? Marbury versus Madison. It's a really famous decision. It's where the court created what they call judicial review, meaning the court rules on law. The court determines whether a law is constitutional. That's where that doctrine came from, Marbury versus Madison. And then McCulloch versus Maryland is pretty much the Congress saying we have this power, states don't have it. And then Youngstown sheet tube. This is a case where the court said the president had overextended his power using an executive order. So this is really important that we keep every branch stays in its lane so that the power stays separated and we maintain those checks and balances. So this is a study that's done by a nonprofit called Our World in Data, and they've scored separation of powers based on it per state. So every state has gotten a score based on how well they separate their powers based on a number of different studies. And you can see in the world, this study doesn't do the United States and Canada, but you can see around the world that many states have adopted this separation of power. And 1 is the worst score and 10 is the best. So if there's color, the darker the color, the better the score for the country. All right, so next we're going to go to the 4th principle that President Oaks spoke about, and that's a written Bill of Rights. And the Constitution itself, one of the arguments at the convention was that the Constitution already protected rights, so we don't need a Bill of Rights. And also the other argument was that since the Constitution only gives the government certain power, there's no need for a Bill of Rights to say what the government doesn't have, because we've already told the government what it has. So those are kind of the arguments against a Bill of Rights. But here's some of the protections that are in the Constitution: trial by juries in there for all crimes, no ex post facto law or bill of attainders. I mean, you can't punish someone without a trial. You can't create a law after the conduct's already occurred and then have somebody liable for that conduct. There's some treason things, and then the privilege and immunities clause or citizens. We won't get in all that today, but so those were kind of the arguments. But obviously, we did end up getting a Bill of Rights. It wasn't passed with the Constitution. It was about it came afterward. And so what President Oak says is, without a Bill of Rights, America could not have served as the host nation for the restoration of the gospel, which began just 3 decades later. There was divine inspiration in the original provision that there should be no religious test for public office, but the addition of the religious freedom and anti-establishment guarantees in the First Amendment was vital. We also see divine inspiration in the First Amendment's freedoms of speech and press, and in the personal protections and other amendments, such as for criminal prosecutions. So this is the original Bill of Rights right here. If you go to Washington, D.C. and look at the National Archives, that's where they have one of the copies of the original Bill of Rights. And you'll notice that there's actually 12 Bill of Rights in here. So the first 2 were not, this was the original draft of the Bill of Rights. The first 2 were not passed. So it was really 2, 3 through 10 that were passed. And again, the Bill of Rights was a pretty big concern at the convention, and you had several people arguing that we needed a Bill of Rights. And so that was one of the first things that passed after the convention. So how has the Bill of Rights done around the world? Let me see what time we have here. So this is 194 countries around the world have adopted a Bill of Rights. 194. That's astonishing. That it shows you the impression, the impact of the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights. So, okay, this is a picture of me at some monument or some building in the U.S. with significance. Anyone know which one it is? I know I'm not giving you much of a hint, but it has George Washington praying in front of it. It's not Valley Forge. No. It has something to do with the 10 First Amendments and where they were drafted. This is Federal Hall in New York City. So if you go to Wall Street and you go find Federal Hall, that has a significance for our country, because that's where the first 10 amendments were drafted. So that's Federal Hall I'm in front of. Okay, so the last one, the purpose of the Constitution. So the purpose of the Constitution is to protect the most fundamental, basic rights of humanity, and for us to all be equal before the law. And President Oak said this: we are not to be governed by law, we are to be governed by law and not by individuals. And our loyalty is to the Constitution and its principles and processes, not to any office holder. In this way, all persons are to be equal before the law. And that notion of equality is so critical to the future of our society. When caste systems and disparities between people develop, it actually it creates problems. It creates difficulties for a country. So this is there's many nonprofits that do studies on the Constitution, and this is a graph of new constitutions. And so the dotted line is the one I want you to focus on, and that's countries with constitutions. And it started with the US Constitution. We know that's the first one. So it started right here. And then through the 1800s and 1850, it slowly grows. 1950s, and then look at it just shoot up in 1960s. This was in part because of the African revolutions in the 1960s where they gained their independence, and then it just increases all the way until 2000. So we have seen from the inception of the United States Constitution just a huge movement. We'll call it a constitutional movement to write your Constitution down. This is another study by our World in Data, and you can see it assesses the rule of law in different countries. And if it's a lighter color, they call it a poor. The rule of law is poor, meaning it's not respected as much. And then as you get to the right side, the darker it is excellent. So you see here, Mexico has a decent score. Some of the Latin American and South American countries are doing real. Chile is the really long one there, and they have a great score. There's Chile, the really long country. Africa, seeing a lot of improvement there. The study doesn't cover Western Europe, but Central Europe seems great. India, and then a few others. Here's Taiwan and South Korea. So the rule of law is important and prevalent in the U.S., and that it essentially started with the U.S. Constitution. So we only have a little bit of time left, and I'm going to take you into a scholarly debate just briefly, though, so we don't get too boring. But there is a scholarly debate going on about the influence of the U.S. Constitution, and there's an article by some law professors was published a few years ago or a number of years ago, saying that the U.S. Constitution is declining and it's out of step with reality. And then there was a rebuttal by several law professors. Those are the ones on the bottom here. Here's our rebuttalists, and here's our proponents of the decreasing Constitution. So this has gone back and forth, and we're going to get their arguments just a little bit, but I like to analogize this to the Wright brothers and the 1903 Wright Flyer. And to go quickly through this, the Wright brothers obviously invented invented flight at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. I mean, the fundamentals of aeronautical engineering are essentially what the Wright brothers discovered, right? I mean, we would not have flight but for the Wright brothers and their experiments. So just think about that a little bit as we get into these arguments, because I think it's a good analogy. So what's the argument that it's declining? Well, these two professors, Law and Vierstig, I'm going to call them Law and Vierstig, they said they did some statistical analysis. They looked at rights provisions, meaning Bill of Rights provisions in the Bill of Rights, and then structural provisions. Structural provisions are kind of the meat of the Constitution. How is the government structured? And they essentially made these arguments. First, they said the Bill of Rights that the U.S. has is out of step. And you might not want to take a picture of these because these are just bad arguments. But anyway, so these are the rights provisions. And so over here on the right, they're saying here's all the rights that no one else has adopted in the world that the U.S. uniquely has. And the right to bear arms is one of those. That's a really the U.S. is often criticized in lectures and things for the right to bear arms. And then here's the rights that everybody kind of has to get that they think are most common. And then here's the rights in the U.S. Constitution that they think overlap with everybody else's rights. But they're trying to make an argument that the U.S. is really different. Then they look at federalism, and this is a graph on federalism, and they say, it's really low, only 20 to 30% of countries have a federalist structure. So they say the U.S. is not doing very well with that. And again, I'm going to keep moving quickly just in the interest of time. And then they talk about judicial review. So judicial review has actually increased substantially. That was actually not a creature of the Constitution, but that case I talked about, Marbury versus Madison. So it's gone from 20% of the world up to 80%. But then they say, yeah, you invented judicial review, but everybody likes a different model of it. It's kind of saying like you invented the all-weather tire, but everybody just wants the rain version. I mean, just not a very good argument to me. So anyway, but that's what they're arguing. And then they just say kind of the U.S. Constitution contains less rights. It's older. There's this American exceptionalism that goes with it. And now countries are starting to use other models for their constitutions. So here's the rebuttal. This is by 3 different law professors. They say you can't just compare bells and whistles on constitutions. There's a difference between modernization and influence. And even if constitutions are modernizing, the US still has a really significant influence. And then another rebuttal was by Vicki Jackson, and she says, increased variations in the framework of evolution and diffusion are not a sign of success or failure. So as more countries adopt written constitutions, this is a sign of success. This is a sign of influence. And I agree. I compare their argument to saying the Wright brothers didn't help us create flight. I think they're trying to argue, listen, look at all the differences between these 2 planes. Like that one has windows. Wright brothers didn't have windows. Well, I mean, it's really, to me, a far-fetched argument to say the Wright brothers did not influence aeronautical engineering and create or help us create what we have flight. Same thing, the US Constitution and the principles we just reviewed, those 5 principles that President Oaks talked about, have been carried throughout the world. There are millions and millions of people enjoying the rights of the US Constitution because their Constitution has adopted those rights. It is truly a remarkable and beautiful thing. And my last point, and this is just very raw, and I'm just trying to figure this out, so maybe you can help me. So here's the growth of the church, right? So 1830 was the start, and then 1947 we hit 1 million members. So that's 117 years. And where would you say, the uptick starts for the membership? Like we really start to see the graph go up. I would say like 1945, 50. Is that fair? Maybe 55. Like we start to see it. We start to see the curve increase. Now let's go back to that constitution model. Where do we see the constitutions in the world start to really uptick? About 45, 50. So I'm going to try to mine that data a little more and see if there's anything to that theory. But just from a kind of superficial level here, it looks like maybe, and obviously a constitution is not the cause. Like a country, if there's a revolution or a country embraces a new government, that opens things up for the gospel of Jesus Christ. But I think a constitution plays a large part of that. So thank you for coming today. Tomorrow, we're going to actually go through how to defend the Constitution. We're going to go through examples and talk about different stories. So thanks again for coming.